Hello friends, today's topic is valuation of residential accommodation. In this topic, we will be learning how to value the residential accommodation provided by the employer. So, we will be learning sub rule 1 of rule 3, where the residential accommodation how is to be valued for the purpose of calculating the benefit in the hands of the employee. First is where the accommodation is provided by the central government. Accommodation provided by the central government, state government as an employer to the employee. The license fee of the property would be considered as the perquisite value in the hands of the employee, where there is an unfurnished accommodation provided. Where there is a furnished accommodation provided, an additional value apart from the license fee would be added. An additional value of the furniture, of the assets of the furnished accommodation will be added to the license fee. The license fee will be added to the 10% value of the assets. So the furnished accommodation would be added to the license fee as an 10% per annum cost of the asset, where the asset is owned by the employer. In cases where the asset is hired by the employer, the hiring charges will be added to the license fee, and at the end the total perquisite value will be deducted by the amount recovered from the employee. Valuation of perquisites provided by the employer directly or indirectly to the employee or to any member of his household by reason of his employment. The employer and employee relationship, first of all, is very much important to be taxed under the head salaries, shall be determined in accordance with rule 3. Valuation of residential accommodation would be as per sub rule 1 of rule 3. Situation 1, accommodation is provided by central government or state government. In case of unfurnished accommodation, license fee determined by CG or SG would be the perquisite value as reduced by the rent actually paid by the employee. Any rent paid by the employee won't be considered as perquisite and it will be reduced from the license fee. Furnished accommodation, additional value will be added to the license fee. The value of perquisite as determined under column 2, this is column 2 in this case, should be increased by, if the furniture is owned by the employer, 10% per annum of the cost of furniture. Furniture includes television sets, radio sets, refrigerators, other household appliances, air conditioning, plant or equipment. So the 10% of the cost of the furnished accommodation, of the furniture, of other assets would be added to the license fee and would be considered as a perquisite value. If such furniture is hired from third party by the employer, the actual hire charges payable for the same would be considered as the perquisite value as reduced by any charges paid or payable for the same by the employee. The same would be deducted. Any amount paid by the employee would be deducted. Now the second category. In the second category, this is regarding the private employer, accommodation provided by the private employer to the employee in cases where the residential accommodation is owned by the employer. In cases where the residential accommodation is owned by the employer, for the unfurnished accommodation first, the perquisite value as per rule 3 would be 15%, where the population of the city exceeds 25 lakhs. 10% of the salary where the population is between 25 lakhs to 10 lakhs. 7.5% where the population is less than 10 lakhs. So there are three categories for the unfurnished accommodation. It is 15%, 10% and 7.5% of the salary. Salary for this purpose would be all the monetary payment to the employee, it won't be considered valuation of perquisite or perquisite value or non-monetary benefit provided to the employee won't be considered. We will be discussing the definition of the salary for the purpose of residential accommodation in detail in further slides. So the second category is private employer. Accommodation is owned by the employer. 15%, 10%, 7.5% would be the perquisite value. For the furnished accommodation, 10% of the cost of the assets would be added to the perquisite value in case it is owned by the employer. If the assets are not owned, they are hired by the employer, the actual hire charges will be added to the unfurnished accommodation perquisite value. So category 2 subcategory 1 is done. Category 2 subcategory 2, that is where the accommodation is taken on rent by the employer. In those cases, the actual rent paid by the employer, the actual rent for the accommodation paid by the employer, or 15% of the salary of the employee will be, whichever is less between the two, will be considered as a perquisite value. 15% of the salary of the employee or actual hire charges, actual rental expenses paid by the employer would be the perquisite value, and to that, if it is a furnished accommodation, 10% cost of the assets or actual hire charges as applicable will be added to the perquisite value. On the screen, now the accommodation is provided by any other employer, which is any other employer is other than central government or state government, owned by the employer. Category 1, 15% of salary in cities having population exceeding 25 lakhs as per 2001 census. 10% of salary in cities having population between 10 lakhs to 5 lakhs, and 7.5% of salary in other areas. This was unfurnished. This is furnished. The value of perquisite is determined under column 2. It should be column 2. Should be increased by furniture owned by the employer. 10% per annum of the cost of the furniture, including television sets, refrigerators, household appliances, air conditioning plant or equipment of similar appliances or gadgets. In respect of the period during which the said accommodation was occupied by the employee. This is very important sentence, in which cases if for 12 months out of 12 months only 5 months the employee has been availing the benefit of the residential accommodation, in those cases we won't be taking the entire 12 months. It will be considered only for 5 months, that is only the period for which the residential accommodation benefit was availed by the employee. So in respect of the period during which the said accommodation was occupied by the employee during the previous year, as reduced by the rent if any actually paid by the employee. If such furniture is hired, then actual hire charges payable for the same as reduced by any charges paid or payable for the same by the employee during the previous year. So subcategory 2, taken on lease or rent by the employer. Actual amount of lease rental paid or payable by the employer or 15% of salary, whichever is lower. And for furnished accommodation, it's same as above, 10% or actual hire charges as reduced by rent if any actually paid by the employee. Fine. Now the third category is where the accommodation is the hotel accommodation provided either by the central government or state government or by the private employer. It could be any other employer. So any employer providing hotel accommodation, the perquisite value will be 24% of the salary of the employee or actual hotel expenses, whichever is lower between the two will be considered as the perquisite value. And there is an exception to this, where there is a transfer from one place to another place of the employee. when there is a transfer of the employee from one place to another, posting of the employee from one place to another for first 15 days in an hotel accommodation, there won't be any perquisite value. Anything, any day exceeding 15 days would be considered as hotel accommodation, and the entire period will be considered as hotel accommodation perquisite. So if a person being transferred from one place to another for the purpose of employment, his number of stay in hotel is 10 days, then there will be no perquisite value. Whereas if he is staying in the hotel for more than 15 days, that is for 20 days for example, then the entire 20 days will be considered as perquisite value, hotel perquisite value in the hands of the employee. On the screen, accommodation is provided by any employer. It could be central government, state government, or private employer, any employer, whether government or any other employer in a hotel. There is no bifurcation as such for furnished or unfurnished accommodation in cases of hotel accommodation. So the perquisite value is 24% of salary paid or payable for the previous year, or the actual charges paid or payable to such hotel, whichever is lower, for the period during which such accommodation is provided. Again, this sentence is important: for the period during which such accommodation is provided by the employer to the employee, as reduced by the rent, if any, actually paid or payable by the employee. However, where the employee is provided with such accommodation for a period not exceeding in aggregate 15 days, on his transfer from one place to another, there would be no perquisite. Note section. Definition of accommodation. What do you mean by accommodation? Accommodation includes house, flat, farmhouse, or part thereof, or accommodation in a hotel, motel, service apartment, which is synonymous to the hotel facilities. Service apartment provides facilities which are similar to hotel, guest house, caravan, mobile home, ship, or any other floating structure. Again, accommodation includes house, flat, farmhouse, or part thereof, or accommodation in a hotel, motel, service apartment, guest house, caravan, mobile home, or ship, or other floating structure. Definition of hotel. Hotel includes accommodation in the nature of motel, service apartment, or guest house. So if there is accommodation in the question paper, the question comes that the accommodation is provided in a hotel, in motel, or service apartment, or guest house, then 24% of the salary of the employee or actual rental charges paid by the employer will be considered as a perquisite value. Also, the exception of 15 days also is to be considered for calculating the hotel accommodation perquisite. Another note section. This is retaining the accommodation at other place. So the cases where a person, an employee, is being transferred from one place to another, and an employee being transferred from one place to another, vis-a-vis he retaining the old accommodation. Okay, for example, the person is being transferred from Mumbai to Chandigarh. In those cases, the Mumbai accommodation is also maintained by the employer. The Mumbai accommodation is also being accommodated by the employee, and as well as the Chandigarh accommodation. In those cases, there is a relief of 90 days provided for calculating the perquisite value, wherein the accommodation, the perquisite value of the accommodation, whichever is more beneficial, is only considered for first 90 days. So the employer has provided the accommodation in Mumbai as well as in Chandigarh, and the Mumbai accommodation is retained by the employee. In those cases, the accommodation of both the accommodation, the perquisite value of both the accommodation won't be calculated for 90 days. Only one of the perquisite value of the accommodation will be calculated. After 90 days, if the employee continues to retain both the accommodation, in those cases the days which are in excess of 90 days, the perquisite value of both the accommodation will be considered. On the screen, if an employee is provided with accommodation on account of his transfer from one place to another at the new place of posting while retaining the accommodation at the other place, the value of perquisite shall be determined with reference to only one such accommodation, which has the lower perquisite value as calculated above for a period not exceeding 90 days. So for a period of 90 days, the perquisite value of the accommodation which is lower only will be considered, and thereafter the value of the perquisite shall be charged for both such accommodations, and thereafter means after 90 days the value of the perquisite shall be charged for both such accommodations. Our next point is that the accommodation is provided to the employee in the mining site, in the oil exploration site, wherein the perquisite value of the temporary accommodation provided to such employees won't be considered as perquisite or benefit in the hands of the employee, but there are several conditions to be satisfied, wherein the accommodation should be a temporary accommodation, it should be of a specific size, it should be in a specific area which is not within 40 kilometers of the municipal area. So on the screen we will be reading the exact wordings. The accommodation provided to an employee working at a mining site or an onshore oil exploration site or project execution site, dam site, power generation site and offshore site would not be treated as a perquisite provided it satisfies either of the following conditions. The accommodation is of temporary nature, has plinth area not exceeding 800 square feet, and is located not less than 8 kilometers away from the local limits of any municipality or cantonment board, or the accommodation is located in a remote area, that is an area that is located at least 40 kilometers away from a town having a population not exceeding 20,000 based on the latest published All India census. So the accommodation provided by the employer to the employee who is working on a mining site or oil exploration site, project execution site, dam site, power generation site and offshore site would not be treated as perquisite value. The accommodation needs to satisfy either of the following conditions. The accommodation may be of temporary nature, has plinth area not exceeding 800 square feet and is located not less than 8 kilometers away from the local limits of municipality or cantonment board, or second condition is the accommodation is located in a remote area meaning the area is located at least 40 kilometers away from a town having a population not exceeding 20,000 based on latest published All India census. Next point is whether accommodation is provided by the central government or state government to an employee who is serving on deputation with an undertaking under the control of such government. The employer of such an employee shall be deemed to be that body or undertaking where the employee is serving on deputation. So the person over here is sent on deputation with an undertaking. In those cases, the employer of such an employee shall be deemed to be that body or undertaking where the employee is serving on deputation, and the value of perquisite of such an accommodation shall be the amount calculated in accordance with the above table as if the accommodation is owned by the employer, employer. Now next point is the cases in which any amount which is recovered from the employee. So we have calculated the perquisite value, and thereafter we need to deduct the amount which is recovered from the employee. In those cases, any amount recovered from the employee will be deducted from the perquisite value. So we will go case by case on the screen. First is the unfurnished accommodation provided to employees other than government employees. If the accommodation is owned, where in cases where the accommodation is owned, the perquisite value is calculated as 15%, 10%, 7.5%. So it is on difference between the specified rate. Specified rate is nothing but 15, 10, 7.5%. Difference between the specified rate and the amount of rent recoverable or recovered from the employee will be the concession in the matter of rent. So part B that we are continuing over here is the value of residential accommodation is calculated. Now there is concession in rent provided by the employer. In those cases, part of the rent is recovered from the employee, so only the balance amount will be taxable as perquisite in the hands of the employee. So first is unfurnished, which accommodation which is owned by the employer, the difference amount is taxable in the hands of the employee. Second is accommodation. Second category is if the accommodation is taken on hire by the employer. In those cases, 15% of the salary or actual hire charges whichever is lower is considered as a perquisite value, and any amount recovered from the employee will be deducted. So rent recovered or recoverable from the employee will be deducted, and only the concessional rent will be considered as perquisite value. Second is furnished accommodation provided to employees other than government employee. In those cases, whatever is the furnished value, that is 10% of the cost of the assets or actual hire charges, that perquisite value is added to the accommodation, and then the amount recovered from the employee is deducted. On the screen, difference between hire charges paid or 10% per annum of cost of furniture as the case may be, and the charges paid or payable by the employee would be added to the value determined in column 2 above for determining whether there is a concession in the matter of rent. In case of furnished accommodation provided to government employees, in those cases the excess of license fees determined by the employer as increased by higher charges or cost of furniture 10% as the case may be, and the charges paid or payable for the furniture by the employer would be deemed to be the concession in the matter of rent. So again, the perquisite value is to be deducted from any amount recovered from the employee, and if the figure is positive, that is the concession in the rent provided to the employee, and that will be the perquisite value which will be taxable in the hands of the employee. In case of accommodation is provided by any employer, whether government or any other employer in a hotel, again the difference between the actual charges paid to hotel or 24% of salary whichever is lower, and rent recoverable from the employee is the concession in the rent. However, again the exception of 15 days will chip in, which is very much applicable in this case also. Now the definition of salary. So the definition of salary for the purpose of calculating the 15% of salary, 10% of salary or 7.5% of salary is to be computed. The salary part will be computed as follows, wherein salary includes pay, allowances, bonus or commission payable either monthly or otherwise, or any other monetary payment. So monetary payment, the wordings monetary payment is important over here. One or more employers as the case may be. So salary includes any monetary payment for the time being. So it includes on any monetary payment over here. However, it does not include. So what it excludes, specifically excludes dearness allowance or dearness pay, unless it is unless it enters into the computation of superannuation or retirement benefits of the employee concerned. So if dearness pay is as per the retirement benefit, any dearness pay, dearness allowance paid as a retirement benefit will be considered for the purpose of salary, and any other dearness pay will not be included for the purpose of calculation of salary for calculating the perquisite of residential accommodation. This was the first exclusion. Second exclusion is employer's contribution. Employer's contribution to the provident fund account. Employer's contribution to the provident fund account of the employee. Third exclusion is allowances which are exempted from payment of tax. Allowances which are exempted: gratuity partly exempt, leave travel concession partly exempt, HRA partly exempt. Those amount which are specifically exempt under section 10, allowances which are specifically exempted from the payment of tax, are not to be included. Value of perquisites specified in section 17(2). So the valuation of perquisite, the perquisite value, which is a non-monetary benefit, won't be included. Fifth exclusion, any payment or expenditure specifically excluded under the proviso to section 17(2). That is, it could be the payment of medical expenditure which is specifically excluded, payment of telephone bills paid by the employer on behalf of the employee could be specifically excluded. So any payment or expenditure specifically excluded under the proviso to section 17(2), that is, payment of medical insurance premium specified therein. So the definition of salary over here includes only monetary payment, and the items which are to be specifically excluded are dearness allowance if it does not form part of the retirement benefit, employer's contribution to PF, allowances which are specifically exempt, payment or expenditure which are specifically exempt under proviso to section 17(2), and value of perquisite which is defined under section 17(2). Now we will move on to the illustration part, wherein on the screen you can see the illustration. Mr. X is a finance manager in A Limited. The company has provided him with rent-free unfurnished accommodation in Mumbai. He gives you the following particulars: basic salary is 6,000 per month, dearness allowance is 2,000 per month, out of which 30% is for retirement benefits. So only 30% will be calculated for the purpose of calculation of salary. Bonus is 1,500 per month. So this is monetary payment. Only 30% of dearness allowance is monetary payment and bonus is monetary payment. So all these three will be included for the purpose of calculation of salary. Question number 1. Even though the company allotted the house to him on 1st of April 2019, he occupied the same only from 1st of November 2019. So the accommodation, though available for accommodating purpose for 12 months, the employee accommodated it only in November, that is November, December, Jan, Feb and March. It was accommodated only for 5 months out of 12 months. Calculate the taxable value of perquisite for assessment year 2021. So the solution part for the part A, in this case, if you read the question, there is nothing mentioned whether the employer is owning the accommodation or not. So we will assume, and you can mention it very much in the note section, saying that the accommodation, in absence of information, it is assumed that the same is owned by the employer. Okay, and the employer being the private employer, the category would be the unfurnished accommodation provided by the private employer, which is owned which is who is owning the accommodation. So in those cases we would have three categories: 15%, 10% and 7.5%. And since the accommodation is in Mumbai, we can assume that the population is more than 25 lakhs, and accordingly 15% of salary of the employee will be considered as the perquisite value. So first of all, how to compute the salary part? Salary would be basic salary, which is 6,000 per month. Here the per month would be the period for which the accommodation was part of the employee. So he has occupied the accommodation for 5 months, that is from 1st of November 2019. So the base salary will also be in this case into 5. Then DNS allowance in those cases would be 2000 into 30% into 5. Then bonus is 1500 into 5. So the total salary would be 6000 into 5, 30,000, 2000 into 30 into 5, which is 3000, 1500 into 5, 7500. So total is 40,500, and 15% of the salary is nothing but 6075. 6075 would be the perquisite value in case of unfurnished accommodation provided by the employer and the accommodation is owned by the employer. So for part A, the perquisite value is 6075. Now question number B, which is compute the value of the perquisite if Mr. X is required to pay a rent of 1000 per annum to the company for the use of this accommodation. So the amount here is provided, the rent is recovered from the employee. So we need to determine the concession in rent, whether there is any concession in the rent. So the perquisite value, assuming it is again an unfurnished accommodation, okay, and the perquisite value circumstances remaining same, the perquisite value would be borrowed from here, which would be 6075, and any concession in rent or any amount recovered from the employee will be 1000 per annum. 1000 per annum is nothing but into 5, which is 5000. So this both is to be compared. The perquisite value without any rent recoverable option is 6075, and the amount recovered from the employee is 5000. Accordingly, the concession is in rent is 6075 minus 5000, which is 1075. Accordingly, 1075 is the perquisite value which will be taxable as concession in rent, and accordingly will be taxable as perquisite in the hands of the employee for part B. Now part C of the question. Compute the value of the perquisite if A Limited has taken this accommodation on lease rent. Now for part A and part B, we had assumed that the accommodation is owned by the employer. Now it is specifically mentioned in the question that this accommodation is on a lease rent of 12,000 per month, and Mr. X is required to pay a rent of 1000 per month. Again, we need to calculate whether there is any concession in rent provided to the employee. Mr. X is required to pay a rent of 1000 per month to the company for use of this accommodation. So again, the accommodation is unfurnished accommodation. However, it is not owned by the employer, it is rented by the employer. So the perquisite value will be calculated as the actual hire charges paid by the employer or 15% of the salary, whichever is lower will be the perquisite value, and then we will consider whether any amount is recovered from the employer. If yes, so is there any concession in the rent provided to the employee. So first condition is actual rent charges. So actual rent charges in this case would be 12,000 into 5. From November only we will be considering it. So the amount is 6,000. Second is 15% of salary. So in our first example we had calculated this, which is 40,500 into 15%, right? So 6075 is the amount. So 6075 is the amount. So whichever is lower, so 6,000 will be the perquisite value, then perquisite value is here, then any amount recovered from the employee, which is 1,000 per month. So again this will be 5,000 for 5 months, and 1,000 amount will be the concession in rent, and accordingly that amount will be the perquisite value which will be taxable in the hands of the employee. So for C part we have 1,000 as the perquisite value which is taxable in the hands of the employee. Now part D of the same question. Compute the value of the perquisite if A Limited has provided a television. Now we are moving on to the furnished accommodation. Television WDV value is given and cost of the asset is given. Here we are more concerned with the cost of the assets. And 2 air conditioners. The rent paid by the company for the air conditioner is 400 per month each. So for each of the AC, the amount paid is 400 per month. The television was provided on 1st of Jan 2020. So Jan, Feb and March, for 3 months the television value will be considered, and for AC 400 per month would be for 5 months and for 2 ACs, so 400 into 5 into 2. However, Mr. X is required to pay a rent of 1,000 per month, so there is a recovery of rent from the employee. So we will have to determine the concession in rent which is provided to the employee. Mr. X is required to pay a rent of 1,000 per month to the company for the use of this furnished accommodation. So again we will be continuing to assume, we'll continue to assume over here that the accommodation is furnished accommodation. Accommodation is owned by the employer. So where the accommodation is owned by the employer, we have to consider 15% of salary, 15, 10% or 7.5. In this case, since the accommodation is in Mumbai, so 15% of salary would be the accommodation value, would be the perquisite value. So 6075, similar to the solution of part A. So 6075 is the perquisite value. To this we will have to add the cost of the furniture. Cost of the furniture will be, first is television. Television is nothing but 25,000 cost of the television into 10%, and that will be not per annum but for 3 months. 3 divided by 12, which is nothing but 2,500 into 3 divided by 12, which is nothing but 625, and the cost of the air conditioner over here is 400 per month into 2 ACs. So it will be 400 into 5 into 2, which is 4,000. So the total furniture value in our case will be 4000 plus 625, which is nothing but 4625. So the Percocet value was 6075, 4625. Cost of the furniture is added over here. 6075 plus 4625 is nothing but 10700, and any amount recovered from the employee, which is in this case 1000 per month, which is 5000, and accordingly there is concession in rent, which is of 5700. So for part D we have solution as 5700 is the taxable perquisite in the hands of the employee. Now the last part of the solution, last part of the question is E part. With reference to D above, compute the value of the perquisite if Mr. X is a government employee. The license fee is determined by the government for this accommodation is 700 per month. So here the rental income in a way is the license fees. License fees is nothing but 700 into 5, which happens to be 3500. Then furniture value is 4625, which is nothing but 3500 plus 4625 is nothing but 8125 minus any amount which is recovered from the employee is nothing but 5000. So 3125 is the concession in rent and accordingly considered as taxable in the hands of the employee. So to sum it up, we have covered over here each and every case for which the residential accommodation perquisite is to be calculated. So friends, this concludes the part of value of residential accommodation, where the accommodation provided by the central government, state government, or by the private employer, how the value is to be computed for unfurnished and furnished accommodation, and we have seen this by way of the illustration as well. Thank you.